Hi everyone, I just wanted to share some research that I was doing earlier today, and it doesn't really have anything to do with this Google Doodle, or it didn't have anything to do with this Google Doodle. I actually didn't even notice it at all. I didn't pay any attention to it until several hours later. I just happened to notice that it looked like there was this hole underneath the earth, and I realized that this is probably just another representation or telegraphing that the pit is about to open. And then once again, it looks like they're making a reference to Gog, because they've left out the second O here. So you have Gog, and so you have someone standing in the middle, and I realized that that's Jane Goodall because I clicked on it to see what it was about. But just based on this first image here, it looks like they're representing Gog. And then you have the two trees here, which I believe represents the DNA, the current condition of the DNA, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which represents the two types of DNA. And then instead of having Christ in the middle, which would be the restored DNA that's depicted in Zechariah 3 and 4, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And it's also pictured in Revelation, where Jesus is standing between the 7 candlesticks, but then it goes on in Revelation 11 to talk about the 2 candlesticks. So the church is really represented by 2 candlesticks. It's a representation of the restored temple, the 2 olive trees, and that's also what's depicted in Zechariah 4, which is preceded by Zechariah 3, which, like I said, I want to talk a little bit more about. But you have the 2 trees here, which represent the 2 DNA, and you have Gog standing in the midst instead of Jesus. And then you have the pit over here, which looks like it's about to be opened. But like I said, this wasn't really what I was researching or what inspired my research. I didn't notice this picture until much later, but then I realized that it had everything to do with what I had been looking into. And what I had been looking into was the Euphrates River and how this all has to do with DNA. And this is all connected to the research that I had been doing before. I had a video that came up in my feed on the Gihon spring. And in this video, it's talking about how this is a river that basically runs through the entire Bible. You see it mentioned here in Revelation 22. It's the same river that was mentioned in Psalm 46, which is a psalm that Obama read at the 9/11 memorial. And 46 is the number of chromosomes in a human body, so it's all ultimately about DNA. It's also the same river that was mentioned in Ezekiel 47, which is what I've been talking about and what I want to get back to eventually. And I want to get back to talking about Hezekiah's tunnel, because what I wanted to point out is how this all has to do with DNA. And you see the 2 places mentioned here where it mentions the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel are 2 Kings 20:20. And so you see the number 222 over here. And I mentioned before how there's 22 autosomes in the human body. It was in Genesis 2:22 when God took one of Adam's ribs to make Eve. And it's also in the Song of Songs that talks about the bride and the bridegroom. And that's the 22nd book of the Bible. I've talked about how there's 3 sets of 22 books for a total of 66 books in the Bible. And it's in the book of Matthew, chapter 22, that it talks about how the kingdom of God is like a wedding. And so these are all numbers or books in the Bible having to do with DNA. And then the other place where it mentions Hezekiah's tunnel is in 2 Chronicles 32:30. So again, you have the 23 and the 23 for a total of 46 chromosomes. And so I believe this is all about DNA. That's why I believe that the tunnel was made in a wavy fashion, just like the river of life, instead of just going straight down. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is why I think 2017 has passed and we're still here. And the thought had occurred to me some time ago as I was talking about Hezekiah's tunnel, that it was actually Hezekiah that God had turned back time for. He had made the sundial go back 10 degrees. And I thought it was interesting how it's in 2 Kings 20. Well, first of all, that's an interesting number because, again, you have the 22, which has to do with DNA, and that's one of the places where it's talking about the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel. But it was in verse 10 that God said that he would make the sundial go back 10 degrees. It's actually first mentioned in verse 9. So you see 10 degrees mentioned in verse 9, and then again in verse 10, and then again in verse 11. So it mentions the 10 degrees 3 times in verses 9 through 11. So I thought that was interesting because you have 9 to 11 or 9:11 right here. And God said that he would make the sundial go back 10 degrees. But it was in verse 10 where God actually said that that's where he would do it. It says, and Hezekiah answered, "It is a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees, nay, but let the shadow return backward 10 degrees. And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz." And so if you go from the middle of these 3 verses here where it talks about the sundial going 10 degrees, it's actually 10 verses later in verse 20 that it talks about the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel. It says, "In the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made a pool and a conduit and brought the water into the city, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah?" So it mentions the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel in 2:20, and it was actually Hezekiah's tunnel that enabled a conduit to the pool of Siloam, which is the pool that was created for healing. It basically enabled what would later be the consummation of the covenant, which is what I've talked about before. I've also talked about how the Gihon spring is also referred to as the fountain of the Virgin, and how the city of David is encompassed by a wall, and how the wall represents the bride, and how this is all a representation of the consummation of the covenant. So he basically enabled the tunnel that would bring about the consummation of the covenant. So this is a foreshadow of the consummation of the covenant. But when Jesus came the first time, I had made a video about how there seems to be a time warp between the years 27 AD and 17 AD, because there's evidence that seems to confirm that Jesus began his ministry in 27 AD, but there's also evidence that seems to confirm that when Jesus died on the cross, it was the year 17 AD. There was an earthquake in Lydia, and there's also the timeline of Daniel's prophecy that I've talked about, and how I believe this date was confirmed, which is a date that Pastor Sandy Armstrong had come up with for the date of creation. That was exactly 6,000 years from today's date, from 2017, and 4,000 years from 17 AD, which would have been when Jesus died on the cross. And I believe it was confirmed because on the Hebrew calendar it would be -222, and that would fit in perfectly with this timeline, because it would begin with 222 and end with 777, and this entire prophecy is about the number 27, because the book of Daniel is the 27th book of the Bible, and it's in verse 27 where it talks about the Messiah confirming the covenant. Okay, and so there's evidence for both the years 27 AD and 17 AD as being the time of Christ, the time of the confirming of the covenant. And so I had done this table, and I had put in the words time warp, 10 years gained. And I don't remember what I said in the video at the time about this, but just looking at it now, it's really interesting that it's coming up in Luke 24, and I didn't notice this until I just pulled it up just a few moments ago. I hadn't looked at it before doing this video. But this is exactly where it talks about Peter running up to the tomb and stooping and looking in and finding the linen cloths. And this is the exact same thing, or the same thing that's being talked about that was in the Matrix that I had done some time ago, which I believe confirms that this was the consummation of the covenant, of the first covenant when Jesus came the first time. I had done a table about that, which seemed to confirm it. But it was in John 27, which looks like 2017, that Peter found the napkin folded, and I talked about how there's a tradition where if the master leaves the table and he folds the napkin, that means that he's not finished, that he's coming back. And so that would seem to be alluding to the year 2017 as being the year when the Messiah would come back. Okay, and then if you go down to verse 2017, which again, this looks like 2017, this is when Jesus said, "Touch me not, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." And so this would seem to allude to this being the year when we can touch Jesus. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make is that this seems to be coming up in a matrix where it's talking about the consummation of the covenant, because I believe that when Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, that was a type and shadow of the consummation of the covenant. And you see that this is when 10 years were gained. And so the 10 years from 27 AD and then going back to 17 AD, there would be a gain of 10 years. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make is that there seems to be a pattern here with Hezekiah, because there was 10 years gained at the time of Hezekiah when he constructed the tunnel. During that time, God had given Hezekiah 10 extra years to live, and then there was 10 years gained at the consummation of the covenant at Jesus' first coming, when he was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. There seems to have been 10 years gained from the years 27 AD to 17 AD. It's like time went back to 17 AD because there's confirmations throughout history that seem to confirm 27 AD. I've talked about that before, and how there were strange events that occurred with the temple that are recorded in the Talmud in 31 AD. That was the only Passover that could account for the 3 days and 3 nights. And so the year 27 AD is confirmed. But then there's also the timeline that seems to confirm 17 AD. When you add up all the figures in the Bible, it comes to a date that's the Hebrew year -222. And then there was also the earthquake in Lydia. So there's confirmations for the year 17 AD as well. And so if the pattern continues, it would seem that when Jesus comes to consummate the covenant, that there will be some type of time warp as well. Whether time goes forward or backwards, I'm not sure. But to me, it would make sense if it went forward, since it went back at his first coming, for it to come forward and for the time to move up to 2027 AD. And so the point that I wanted to make is that it appears that the numbers 17 and 27 are synonymous with each other throughout the scriptures. And this all seems to be connected with DNA, which I want to talk a lot more about. But in Jeremiah 46, there's another indication that we might still be in the year 2017. And it's over here in verses 17 and 18. It says, "They did cry there, Pharaoh king of Egypt is, but annoys, he hath passed the time appointed." But then it continues in verse 18 to say, "As I live, saith the king, whose name is the Lord of hosts, so shall he come." So God is saying he's still coming, and this is coming up in verse 18. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.